Okay, now.
Thank you. May the peace of Christ be with you all. In my first, it's been about 100 days as a conference minister here. I've been traveling to churches every Sunday and speaking everywhere. And please get me on your calendar if I'm not on the calendar of your church yet, because I am so enjoying getting to know the churches. I have seen incredible courage, incredible fortitude, particularly after what we've experienced over the last 2 years, but also the challenge. I said a little bit about that in a recent column I wrote called Post-COVID Church Conflict Got You Down, where I said that if you're seeing about 30% of the people you saw before COVID, that's normal. And if you're seeing 50%, that's a victory. And don't be discouraged. It is interesting times across the board, across denominations. So let me go back, though, and give a little UCC history perspective on the topic at hand. I want to talk a little bit about the congregational branch of the UCC family tree, and that was the early Puritans and Pilgrims who escaped religious persecution in England, made their way to Holland. And by the way, they didn't call themselves the Puritans. That was sort of an insulting term that other people called them. They saw themselves as pilgrims and as congregationalists. They thought the ministry belonged to the congregation. And as they were getting on the Mayflower, their pastor in Holland, who had come with them from England but was not able to go on the ship himself, gave a sermon in which he said, "There is yet more light and truth to break forth from God's holy word. There is yet more light and truth to break through from God's holy word." In other words, the Bible is not a dead historic book, but with the interaction of the Holy Spirit, God is still speaking. So those people came to this country back when it was the colonies, and they set up not churches with stained glass windows or with center aisles for processions. Why did they not set up their churches that way? Because they hated the people who set up their churches that way. They were on the run for them. So they wanted to be different. They had no center aisle because they didn't want pomp and circumstance or anything that reminded them of hierarchy or the royalty that they had left behind with the Church of England. They called their churches not churches, but meeting houses. And their vision was highly democratic. It was that there would be no boundary between the life of faith and civic life or regular life. And so that everything they did in what they saw they were creating as a utopian community, a new Israel, the meeting house was where you would vote on matters for the village or the town, as well as vote in church on things like who to have as your pastor. And that small d democracy of the early Congregationalists, a lot of scholars and historians have said we would not have American democracy were it not for those models that were laid down by those early churches. One of the things they believed, and if you have a chance to go to New England and see some of our really old churches that go back to, 1600s, 1700s, etc., they will be on the church green, and again, no center aisle, no stained glass windows, clear windows. They had a theology for that. They believed that you wanted the windows clear so that the light of the gospel could always shine out into the world, but that the pain and problems of the world were always visible inside the church. So you see, there was no separation between the life of faith and life itself. However, with that gift of democracy in the churches that later helped form American democracy, for better or worse, they had their own moral failings. They had the obvious things that we see looking back that they missed. Here's one of them. A group that was struggling with religious oppression themselves, on the run, came here, established this highly democratic system, but who could vote? It was only white, male, landowning, congregational church members. Sometimes when you think you are cutting edge and good, you have still missed the obvious. Well, they move forward. You know the list of historic firsts of the UCC, early out on abolition, on the ordination of women, groundbreaking stances on equality of marriage, et cetera, et cetera. And we like to consider those our legacy, and we should be proud of them. But I also always like to consider the humanity of any group that we look back on historically or who we are today. And for me, there's a story from early in my ministry, the first church I served. It was a church in Cheshire, Connecticut. And Cheshire, Connecticut had been a rural community and had a very old church from the 1800s, historic church with the clear windows and no center aisle. And in the balcony, there were regular balcony pews, but then all of a sudden there was like a notch in the pew, and there was these like 6 seats in this one pew where the backrest was shorter and the armrest was different. And it almost looked like, I said, was this maybe for like small children or something like that? And the senior pastor there, who was my mentor, he had been the pastor there for 32 years. He said, "Lillian, those are the slave pews." I was shocked. This was New England. I knew the historic first. This was Connecticut. This was the same place as the Amistad story got happening. And I said, I had no idea that in the Cheshire church, they had slaves. And he said, yes. He said, but not only that, they considered themselves to be good and righteous and progressive because they allowed the slaves to attend worship with them. That was, in their minds, the height of morality and goodness, and they were proud of it. Now, the very idea that you would do that, but then cut off the backs of the pews to make them just a little bit less comfortable and different, it's such an obvious moral failing. That pastor said to me, every year or so, somebody in the church says to me, we've got to pull out those slave pews. We've got to redo them. We've got to get rid of them. And he says, never on my watch. It's so important they remain because they tell us in the church that we can never forget that at one point in history, when we thought we were right, we were still wrong. Often, I think if we could just kick all the human beings out of the church, we could really do this Jesus thing. None of us are perfect. No denomination is perfect. And yet I'm also here in Chicago this weekend as a member of the board of the Community Renewal Society, a historic, important organization with long roots in the United Church of Christ and its forebears. And this organization started a groundbreaking publication, the Chicago Reporter, whose 50-year anniversary we're celebrating just last night. And they were a publication that exposed statistics that led us as a nation and even internationally to have a more sophisticated understanding of environmental racism, or the corruption of our incarceration system and the effects of policing and incarceration on children in our community. So that secular organization, that secular magazine, like so many others, had as part of its origin story faithful members of the UCC and our forebears. Today, in our culture, we've referenced it, but I've picked up on it in my visits to churches, that the incredibly low level and meanness of political discourse in this country over the last 2 years has found its way into some of our churches. It has placed enormous stresses and strains on lay leaders and clergy during the 2 years of COVID. We knew we had culture wars in the country before COVID, but in COVID, it got intense and we saw divisions we didn't know we had. And I know as a pastor, I felt like during the last 2 years, I never worked harder to less effect. And how many of you as lay leaders spent hours in meetings planning for things that then changed on a dime? And how many of us experienced that low level and meanness of political discourse that found its way in. And that has taken a toll on us. But I still remain hopeful that the church is one of the only places in our society that we still sit next to people with whom we disagree. And we still have something called a prayer of confession, where we acknowledge on a regular basis that sometimes when we think we are right, we could still be wrong. And it is in our historic DNA to rebel against the powers of the princes and principalities, be it the royal authorities back in England or one particular political platform in this nation. We do not respect the powers and principalities. We cling to the gospel born out of the teachings of the prophets like Micah, who would have been studied by Jesus Christ. And as our moderator today so aptly revealed in her scriptural unveiling of Micah, this is the key question for every generation. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? It is that humility that I want to end with today. As I celebrate the courageous stands of the UCC, and as I am prepared for the struggles and trials ahead, particularly in the state of Michigan, with the respect of women to have autonomy over their bodies, but for the care and value of all human beings, I recall that old Cheshire church and its slave pews. I remember that with humility. And so as we celebrate courageous stands, as we move forward, let us remember that church and its slave pews. Clearly, when they thought they were good, they were not. They were not perfect. And in humility, this is the question I think we must ask. Today, when grandchildren ask their grandparents and look back on the civil rights movement and the integration of churches and schools, and they scratch their heads and they say, Grandma, what were you thinking? And where was your church in all of that? We in the UCC have a strong answer. But as we walk in humility, what question will I be asked in the last years of my life by the youngest generation who will look to me and say, Grandma, look at this world, whether it is the devastation of climate change or whether we live in a dystopian future where clean water costs more than gas does today. And that young person says, Grandma, what were you all thinking? And what did your church do? I want to have an answer. And in my most hopeful moment, that child asked the question like this, Grandma, what did our church do for that future human being's participation in the worship of Jesus Christ depends upon what we do now. And is therefore my faith lies in that and in our local churches. I pray that God will bless us in our worship, from which springs all of the actions that we have discussed today. May God bless us with the humility to know we are fallible and the discernment to see what is ahead.
Thank you. That was so well said. We really appreciate you, Dr. Daniel. You are wonderful. And we're looking forward to October the 22nd and 23rd, which will be 2 days of jubilance. We look forward to seeing you along the way. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, that concludes our meeting, and we will pivot, if you will, to the DMA business meeting. Those of you who want to remain and stick with us, you're welcome to do that. I know, Dr. Daniel, you're probably on your way to get back to Michigan. So safe travels. The angels will go ahead of you, clearing and paving the way. All right.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you for that. Thank you
Yes.
for that.
All is
Yes,
well.
yes.
Thank you again. All right. So let's see. Galen and Dorinda, are we ready for our business meeting?
I believe so.
Okay, that sounds good. I know, Marguerite, go find Galen. No, no, I'm just kidding.
He's there, but he's muted.
Oh, he's muted. Okay. Bless his heart. He's been so busy. All right. So here we go. We're going to open the business meeting of the fall meeting.